For more than 3 decades, the name O.J. Simpson has remained one of the most controversial in American history. To many, he was once a celebrated football star, a television personality, and a symbol of success. To others, his name became forever linked to violence, tragedy, and unanswered questions following the brutal murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman in June 1994. While the trial focused heavily on O.J. Simpson himself, very little attention was given to the lives that were quietly shattered in the background, especially the lives of his children. Among them was his daughter, Sydney Brooke Simpson, who spent most of her life avoiding the spotlight and refusing to speak publicly about the night that changed everything. For years, her silence led to endless speculation, rumors, and assumptions, but she chose distance instead of drama, privacy instead of publicity. As time passed, that silence became part of her identity, not as an act of denial, but as a way to survive a reality too heavy for public debate. Sydney was only a child when her mother, Nicole Brown Simpson, was found murdered outside her Brentwood home. At an age when most children are learning to feel safe in the world, her sense of security was violently taken away. The case that followed did not only divide a nation, it also fractured a family beyond repair. Media coverage was constant, loud, and unforgiving. Cameras followed every development, while opinions hardened on both sides. In the middle of all this chaos were 2 children whose grief was largely ignored. While the world argued over guilt and innocence, Sydney was left to grow up with loss, confusion, and memories she never asked to carry. From an early age, she learned that speaking could bring danger, exposure, and pain. Silence became a shield, not because she had nothing to say, but because saying anything came with consequences she was not ready to face. As the years went by, Sydney disappeared almost completely from public view. Unlike many children connected to famous or infamous figures, she did not write books, give interviews, or seek sympathy from the media. Instead, she focused on building a quiet life away from her father's shadow. Reports over the years suggested that she struggled deeply with anxiety and emotional stress during her childhood and teenage years. Loud noises, sudden attention, and unfamiliar environments reportedly caused fear rather than comfort. These reactions were not unusual for someone who had experienced extreme trauma at such a young age. Yet, despite these challenges, Sydney showed signs of resilience. She pursued education, kept her personal relationships private, and worked hard to create a life defined by her own choices rather than her last name. Following the death of O.J. Simpson in 2024, public attention once again turned toward his children, especially Sydney. Many wondered whether she would finally speak, whether she would acknowledge him, or whether she would accept any connection to his legacy. What became clear instead was not a loud public statement, but a series of quiet, deliberate decisions. Through legal actions, personal boundaries, and continued refusal to engage with the media, Sydney made her position known without standing in front of cameras. Her actions suggested a desire to close a chapter that had been left open for far too long. Rather than reopening old wounds, she appeared to choose control over her narrative in a way that felt firm, calm, and final. This story is not about revenge or public accusation. It is about a woman who grew up surrounded by tragedy and chose a different path, one built on distance, privacy, and the determination to live a life that belongs only to her. The night of June 12, 1994, became a dividing line in Sydney Brooke Simpson's life, separating childhood innocence from a future shaped by fear and uncertainty. While the public focused on crime scene photos, police chases, and courtroom drama, the experience of the children inside that home was largely left unspoken. Sydney was very young at the time, an age when the mind absorbs events without fully understanding them, yet never truly forgets. Many experts on childhood trauma explain that memories formed during moments of extreme stress often return later in fragments, sounds, images, feelings, rather than complete stories. For a child, these fragments can become overwhelming, especially when adults around them avoid discussing what happened. In Sydney's case, silence did not mean peace. It meant learning how to live with unanswered questions and emotions that had no safe place to go. In the years that followed the murders of her mother, Sydney's life reportedly changed in ways that were not visible to the outside world. She was moved between caregivers, environments, and routines, each change adding another layer of instability. Psychologists often say that children who experience sudden loss, especially through violence, develop heightened alertness. Ordinary sounds can feel threatening. Normal disagreements can feel like danger. This kind of emotional response is not weakness. It is the brain trying to protect itself. According to records and accounts referenced in later years, Sydney showed signs of anxiety that affected her daily life, including difficulty sleeping and fear of loud or unexpected noises. These reactions suggest a child who is constantly on guard, even when there was no immediate threat. What made Sydney's situation even more complex was the public nature of her family's tragedy. Unlike most children dealing with loss, she could not grieve in private. Her family name appeared in headlines, documentaries, and conversations across the country. Even when she was not mentioned directly, the story followed her. At school, among adults, and within extended family circles, the case was always present. Many children in similar situations learn early that speaking openly can bring unwanted attention. For Sydney, remaining quiet became a way to avoid reopening wounds or becoming part of a public debate she never agreed to join. Silence became a form of self-protection, not denial. As she grew older, the pressure to speak did not disappear. In fact, it increased. Each anniversary of the murders, each new documentary, and each renewed discussion of the trial brought fresh attention. Yet Sydney continued to step back rather than step forward. Some observers interpreted her silence as avoidance, but trauma specialists often describe it differently. They explain that choosing not to speak can be a healthy response when a person is not emotionally prepared or when speaking does not offer healing. For Sydney, control over when and how to remember may have mattered more than satisfying public curiosity. There is also the complicated issue of memory itself. Children do not experience or store memories the same way adults do. Events may be remembered as sensations rather than clear images. Over time, these memories can become both powerful and confusing. This makes public discussion even more difficult. Anything said can be challenged, analyzed, or misinterpreted. For someone who spent her life trying to stay out of the spotlight, this risk may have felt unbearable. Instead of turning her pain into a public statement, Sydney focused on stability, education, and emotional survival. By choosing silence, Sydney did not erase the past. She learned to live alongside it. Her childhood was shaped not only by what happened that night, but by what followed. Years of emotional recovery carried out away from cameras and headlines. The absence of public words does not mean the absence of truth or feeling. Sometimes, it reflects a deeper understanding that healing does not always require explanation. For Sydney Brooks Simpson, the night that changed everything did not end with a single event. It became a lifelong process of coping, remembering, and deciding how much of that pain the world was allowed to cede. As Sydney Brooks Simpson moved from childhood into her teenage years, the challenge was no longer only about surviving the immediate shock of loss, but about growing into an adult while carrying a name that the world refused to forget. For many children of famous or infamous parents, adolescence becomes a struggle between identity and expectation. In Sydney's case, this struggle was intensified by trauma and constant public curiosity. While other teenagers explored their interests freely, she had to remain careful, guarded, and aware of how quickly attention could turn invasive. Her approach to life during these years appeared to focus on distance from media, from public discussion, and from any environment that could pull her back into a story she never chose to tell. Education became one of the few spaces where Sydney could attempt to build a sense of normalcy. School, while not always easy, offered structure and routine. Reports from later years suggested that she experienced emotional challenges that affected her ability to fully engage in traditional school environments. Anxiety, sensitivity to stress, and difficulty trusting others were part of her reality. These struggles are common among individuals who experience early childhood trauma, especially when that trauma is followed by years of instability. However, What stands out in Sydney's story is not the presence of these difficulties, but her determination to keep moving forward despite them. Rather than allowing her past to define her limits, she worked quietly to adapt. As she grew older, therapy and emotional support reportedly played a role in helping her manage the lasting effects of trauma. Mental health professionals often emphasize that healing is not a straight path. Progress can come in stages, with setbacks along the way. For Sydney, healing did not mean forgetting or forgiving. It meant learning how to function without being overwhelmed by fear or memory. This process likely took years, and it unfolded far from public view. While the media speculated about her life, her actual growth happened privately, through steady effort rather than dramatic moments. Choosing to pursue higher education marked another important step in Sydney's journey toward independence. Attending university allowed her to redefine herself outside the context of her family history. Her academic interests reportedly leaned toward understanding human behavior, social systems, and the effects of crime and trauma on families. While she avoided publicly linking her studies to her personal past, the connection is easy to understand. Many individuals who experience early trauma develop a desire to understand why people act the way they do and how harm spreads across generations. For Sydney, education may have served both as a tool for personal understanding and as a path toward building a future rooted in purpose rather than pain. Throughout these years, Sydney maintained a consistent distance from public discussions about her parents. She did not attend high-profile events related to the case, nor did she use anniversaries as moments to speak. This pattern of behavior suggests a deliberate choice rather than avoidance. Trauma experts often explain that reclaiming control is a crucial part of recovery. For someone whose early life was shaped by events completely outside her control, the ability to decide what parts of her story remained private may have been deeply empowering. Social relationships during this time also appeared to reflect caution. Those close to Sydney reportedly understood her need for boundaries and discretion. Trust, once broken early in life, can take years to rebuild. Instead of seeking large social circles or public attention, she seemed to prefer smaller, safer environments where her identity was not constantly questioned. This does not suggest isolation, but intentional selectivity, a way to protect emotional stability while still engaging with the world on her own terms. Growing up in the shadow of a highly publicized tragedy is not something most people can truly imagine. For Sydney Brooks Simpson, the challenge was not only about moving forward, but about doing so quietly, without being pulled back into narratives created by others. Through education, therapy, and deliberate distance from the past, she began shaping a life that was less about where she came from and more about who she chose to become. Her journey during these formative years reflects resilience built slowly and privately, far from the noise that once surrounded her name. As Sydney Brooks Simpson entered adulthood, the focus of her life gradually shifted from healing to building something stable and independent. For someone whose early years were marked by chaos and public scrutiny, adulthood offered an opportunity to reset the direction of her story. Instead of confronting the past through public statements or interviews, Sydney appeared to take a quieter route, one centered on work, routine, and personal responsibility. This phase of her life was defined not by dramatic revelations, but by steady decisions that reflected her desire to remain outside the public eye while still moving forward with confidence and purpose. One of the most noticeable patterns in Sydney's adult life has been her consistent effort to separate her identity from her father's name. While many people connected to famous figures benefit from recognition, she seemed determined to avoid it. She reportedly avoided media appearances, declined interview requests, and kept her professional activities low profile. This was not an act of hiding, but rather an intentional boundary. Privacy became a core value, not because she had something to conceal, but because public exposure had already taken so much from her earlier in life. By controlling access to her personal information, she created a sense of safety that had long been missing. Professionally, Sydney chose paths that emphasized independence rather than visibility. Her work in real estate and business reportedly allowed her to build financial stability without relying on public attention or family connections. Business ownership can be demanding, but it also offers control over pace, environment, and personal involvement. For someone who had lived through years of unpredictability, this control may have been deeply meaningful. Instead of being defined by headlines, she became defined by her work ethic and quiet professionalism. Alongside her professional life, Sydney also began building a personal life rooted in stability and trust. Forming long-term relationships after childhood trauma is often challenging, especially when trust has been damaged early on. Yet, over time, she appeared to establish a family structure that reflected her values: privacy, security, and emotional safety. Marriage and parenthood, when approached with care, can represent not just personal milestones, but also acts of renewal. By creating her own family, Sydney was able to establish traditions and boundaries separate from the past she inherited. Another significant aspect of her adult life has been her continued refusal to engage with media narratives surrounding the O.J. Simpson case. Even as documentaries, podcasts, and anniversary specials continued to appear, Sydney maintained her distance. This consistency is important. It suggests that her silence was not temporary or reactive, but part of a long-term strategy to protect her mental health and personal life. While public curiosity remained intense, she did not allow it to dictate her choices. Instead, she responded through action, by living a life that did not revolve around explaining or defending herself. In addition to personal and professional boundaries, Sydney's adult years also reflected a sense of social awareness. Reports suggest that she supported causes related to domestic violence and childhood trauma, often without public acknowledgement. This quiet involvement reveals another layer of her character. Rather than using her background to seek recognition, she appeared to channel her experience into empathy. Helping others without drawing attention allowed her to contribute in a way that aligned with her values while maintaining privacy. The decision to remain private in a world that constantly demands access is not an easy one. For Sydney Brooks Simpson, it required discipline, legal awareness, and emotional strength. Every refusal to speak publicly was likely a reminder of why she chose that path in the first place. Her adult life demonstrates that moving on does not always require closure in the traditional sense. Sometimes, it requires boundaries strong enough to protect what has been rebuilt. Through independence, deliberate distance, and quiet determination, Sydney shaped an adult life that stood apart from the tragedy of her past, proving that identity can be reclaimed not through explanation, but through choice. The death of O.J. Simpson in 2024 marked a moment many people believed would bring closure to one of the most debated stories in modern history. For the public, it reopened conversations about guilt, justice, and legacy. For Sydney Brooks Simpson, however, the moment carried a very different meaning. It was not about public judgment or renewed attention, but about final separation. While many expected a statement, a reaction, or even a gesture of reconciliation, what followed instead was silence reinforced by clear personal choices. These choices spoke more strongly than words ever could, showing how firmly Sydney had decided to define her life on her own terms. In the weeks following her father's death, attention turned once again toward his family. Questions circulated about inheritance, funerals, and emotional responses. Yet Sydney did not step into the spotlight. Instead, reports indicated that she took deliberate legal steps to distance herself from any remaining ties. Declining involvement in estate matters and refusing public association with her father's legacy reflected a position that had been forming for many years. This was not a sudden reaction driven by emotion, but the continuation of a long-standing boundary. For Sydney, separation was not an act of anger, but an act of clarity. Psychologists often explain that for individuals who grow up in traumatic family environments, closure does not always come from forgiveness or confrontation. Sometimes, it comes from finality. The death of a parent can force unresolved feelings to the surface, but it can also provide a clear end to a painful chapter. In Sydney's case, her response suggested that she had already done much of the emotional work long before this moment arrived. By the time the world focused its attention on her again, she had already decided how she would handle it, quietly, firmly, and without compromise. Another aspect that stood out was her refusal to engage in symbolic gestures. She did not attend public memorials, nor did she participate in media-driven discussions about her father's life or character. In a culture that often demands visible emotion, this absence was meaningful. It reflected a belief that personal healing does not require public performance. For Sydney, maintaining distance was not about denying the past, but about refusing to let it dominate her future. Her silence was not empty, it was intentional. Legal separation also played a role in this final phase. By formally removing herself from matters connected to her father's estate, Sydney reinforced the boundaries she had been building for years. Legal experts often point out that such decisions are rarely simple, especially when they involve family and public figures. They require planning, certainty, and a willingness to stand by one's values even when under scrutiny. Sydney's actions suggested that she had carefully considered these consequences and accepted them as part of her path forward. What makes this moment particularly significant is the contrast between public expectation and private reality. Many people hoped for a dramatic revelation or a definitive statement that would settle decades of debate. Instead, they were met with restraint. This restraint highlighted an important truth: not every story belongs to the public, even if it has been discussed publicly for years. Sydney's life was shaped by events that others analyzed endlessly, yet she retained the right to decide how much of herself she would share. In the end, O.J. Simpson's death did not redefine Sydney Brooks Simpson's life. Rather, it confirmed the direction she had already chosen. Her response was not loud, emotional, or confrontational. It was steady and consistent with everything she had done since childhood. Through legal distance, personal silence, and emotional clarity, she closed a chapter that had long been left open by others. This final separation was not about erasing the past, but about ensuring that it no longer controlled her present or her future. The idea of legacy is often discussed in terms of wealth, fame, or public memory, but for someone like Sydney Brooks Simpson, legacy carries a far more personal meaning. Growing up connected to one of the most controversial figures in American history meant that she inherited not only a famous name, but also the weight of assumptions, judgments, and expectations she never asked for. Over time, however, Sydney's life choices suggest that she redefined legacy in her own way. Rather than allowing her identity to be shaped by her father's past, she focused on building a future grounded in independence, stability, and personal ethics. In doing so, she demonstrated that legacy is not something we must accept without question. It is something we can consciously reshape. Healing, in Sydney's case, did not follow a traditional or publicly visible path. There were no interviews explaining her pain, no memoirs detailing her memories, and no public moments of confrontation. Instead, healing appeared to take place quietly through years of therapy, personal growth, and deliberate separation from the source of her trauma. Mental health professionals often stress that healing looks different for everyone. For some, speaking out brings relief. For others, maintaining privacy offers safety. Sydney's journey reflects the latter. By protecting her boundaries, she gave herself the space to heal without external pressure or judgment. Another important element of her story is the concept of choice. Much of Sydney's early life was shaped by circumstances beyond her control. As a child, she did not choose her family situation, the violence that occurred, or the intense media attention that followed. As an adult, however, she began to reclaim choice in meaningful ways. She chose where to live, what career to pursue, and how much of her personal life to share. She chose to step away from narratives that tried to define her and instead focused on creating a life that reflected her values. These choices, repeated consistently over time, became the foundation of her independence. Sydney's life also highlights an often overlooked aspect of high-profile tragedies: the long-term impact on children. While public discussions tend to focus on trials, verdicts, and headlines, the emotional consequences for families can last for decades. Children grow into adults carrying invisible burdens that are rarely acknowledged. Sydney's refusal to engage in public storytelling does not erase this impact, it underscores it. Her silence serves as a reminder that some wounds are too personal to be explained and that respect for privacy is a form of compassion. Despite her desire to remain private, Sydney's actions still convey a message. Through her support of causes related to domestic violence and childhood trauma, she appears to have transformed personal pain into quiet purpose. Helping others without seeking recognition reflects a deeper form of strength. It suggests that she understands suffering not as a spectacle, but as a shared human experience that deserves care and understanding. In this way, her legacy becomes one of resilience rather than controversy. As time moves forward, the public conversation around the O.J. Simpson case will likely continue. New generations will discover the story, documentaries will be revisited, and debates will resurface. Yet Sydney Brooke Simpson's life stands apart from this cycle. She has chosen not to participate in it, and that choice deserves respect. Her story is not about confirming or denying public theories. It is about survival, self-definition, and the right to live without being constantly tied to a past that caused profound harm. In the end, Sydney's journey offers a broader lesson. We are not permanently bound by the actions of those who came before us. Even in the shadow of tragedy, it is possible to rebuild, redefine, and move forward with integrity. By choosing privacy, independence, and emotional clarity, Sydney Brooke Simpson has shown that the most powerful form of closure is not public validation, but personal peace. The story of Sydney Brooke Simpson continues to matter not because of sensational headlines or unresolved public debates, but because it reflects the often unseen consequences of family tragedy. While history remembers major cases through courtroom moments and media coverage, the real impact extends far beyond verdicts and public opinion. It lives on in the private